The year is somewhere in the late 1500s, the most powerful woman in the world. Queen Elizabeth I of England lies down to sleep. No velvet canopy bed, no silk sheets, no feather-stuffed mattress fit for a monarch. Instead, her resting place is the hard, uneven floor of a damp palace chamber, covered in old rushes, a makeshift flooring of dried plants. And in those rushes, under the rotting layers, the floor is alive. Tiny pale worms squirm between the stalks, twisting through the damp, decaying mass. This isn't a gruesome fairy tale or a political smear from her enemies. It's the reality of life inside even the grandest Tudor palaces. Behind the gold-trimmed gowns and jeweled crowns, the Tudor world was a place where filth could sit for years, where hygiene was a privilege nobody truly had, and where a royal bedroom could smell more like a barn than a boudoir. We imagine monarchs as untouchable, living in pure luxury.
But
Elizabeth's England was a land where rot could creep into the royal chamber. The same woman who commanded the defeat of the Spanish Armada, who inspired an entire era of English culture, who could bend the will of her court with a single glance. This woman would lay her head on a pillow, just a few inches from crawling, living decay. The worms in Elizabeth's rush flooring weren't accidental intruders. They were the inevitable product of Tudor domestic life. In the age before carpets and sanitation, floors in wealthy homes were covered with bundles of reeds or straw, meant to soften the step and insulate against the cold. Oh, but those rushes weren't replaced daily, or even monthly. In some cases, the lower layers could sit there for years. Food scraps, spilled wine, and chamber pot waste seeped in. Rats came for the crumbs. Insects came for the waste. Worms came for the rot. Even if Elizabeth's personal attendants tried to keep her rooms clean, the truth was that this was a losing battle. The queen often moved between palaces, and each place she stayed had its own inherited dirt, its own neglected flooring, and its own teeming little population of creatures hidden just under the surface. The servants might scatter fresh rushes on top before her arrival, but beneath that thin green veil, the old layers festered, a perfect breeding ground. So when Elizabeth laid her bedding down on the floor, she wasn't entering a pristine royal sanctuary. She was stepping into centuries of neglect, a quiet, crawling reminder that even queens could not command nature to stay outside their walls. The irony. In an age where her image had to be spotless, her reality could not have been dirtier. To understand why a queen could end up sleeping in filth, you have to step inside the Tudor palace, not the image painted in official portraits. But the truth hidden in the smell, the dampness, and the shadowed corners the court preferred not to speak of. Elizabeth I's residences, Hampton Court, Whitehall, Woodstock, Hatfield, were monuments to power. From the outside, they were dazzling. Red brick walls stretching high against the gray English sky, stained glass windows catching the light, tapestries worth fortunes hanging in the great halls. But those same halls had no running water, no sewer system, no way to banish the waste of hundreds of courtiers, servants, guards, and guests, other than throwing it into cesspits or straight into the Thames. The Queen's personal chambers were supposed to be different, cleaner, more refined. But here's the truth. No one wrote into the Gilded Chronicles. Filth is not choosy. When you fill a palace with people, animals, and food, without modern sanitation, the result is rot. The grand kitchens turned out feasts of roasted meat and rich puddings, but scraps fell to the floor and were ground into the rushes. Servants tracked in mud and manure from the courtyards. Cats and dogs roamed freely inside, their mess adding to the layers. The rush flooring, meant to be a clever Tudor innovation, was in fact a trap. Fresh reeds scattered across the top looked clean enough for a royal visit, but underneath, the older rushes formed a dense, matted underworld, perfect for breeding vermin. It stayed damp in winter, warm in summer, and alive all year round. Spilled wine seeped in like blood into a bandage. Breadcrumbs lodged between stalks, rotting in place. Rats burrowed. Fleas multiplied, and the worms ate. They thrived, pale and slick, feeding on the decomposing mass just beneath the Queen's feet. Even if the courtiers noticed, they did not speak of it openly. Tudor etiquette demanded that the Queen's body, and by extension her surroundings, be seen as almost sacred. Publicly, Elizabeth was the untouchable Virgin Queen. Privately, she was a human being living in an environment centuries away from the concept of cleanliness, and this was not unique to Elizabeth. Henry VIII had walked the same worm-ridden rushes before her. Foreign ambassadors complained of the stale and unwholesome air in English palaces decades earlier. But Elizabeth's reign lasted long enough for her to see the effects firsthand, the insects scattering when bedding was moved, the stench that lingered even after the windows were thrown wide. The throne may have been spotless in the paintings, but beneath it, the palace floor was a living thing. And like all living things, it demanded to be acknowledged, even by the Queen herself. Elizabeth I was no ordinary monarch, and her sleeping habits were as peculiar as the woman herself, raised during the dangerous intrigue-filled years of the Tudor court. She learned early on that comfort was a luxury she couldn't always trust. Beds could hide assassins. Bedrooms could be bugged with ears eager for gossip. Privacy was fragile, and safety even more so. It's recorded that Elizabeth often chose to sleep in places her enemies would least expect. Sometimes she moved between chambers at the last minute. Other times she ordered her bedding set up in unusual locations. This kept her attendants and any would-be spies guessing, but her unpredictability often placed her in rooms or corners of the palace that weren't prepared for her in advance. That meant floors that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, rushes that hadn't been replaced in years, and infestations that thrived in the shadows of disuse. Elizabeth also valued what she saw as Tudor toughness. While other monarchs across Europe flaunted lavish four-poster beds with silk draperies, she occasionally preferred a more austere sleeping arrangement. It was a kind of personal discipline, a way to remind herself she was above physical weakness. To her, a hard night on the floor was proof she could endure anything. But in Tudor England, the floor was not bare wood. It was a soft, deceptively inviting layer of rotting rushes alive with tiny creatures, her ladies-in-waiting, sworn to silence about the Queen's private life. Must have witnessed moments they dared not describe. Imagine the scene. A chamber dimly lit by flickering candlelight. Elizabeth's mattress laid directly atop the rushes. As her weight settled in, the warm, damp bedding stirred the layers beneath. Worms, disturbed from their hiding places, wriggled to the surface. Some moved slowly through the stalks. Others thrashed in tiny arcs, blind and relentless. If Elizabeth noticed, and surely she must have, she gave no public complaint. To acknowledge it would have been to admit that the ruler of one of the most powerful nations on earth was powerless against the creeping filth of her own home. The Queen was a master of appearances, and appearances were everything. There is even speculation among some historians that she tolerated such discomfort for political effect. Elizabeth liked to present herself as a monarch, married to her duty, not to pleasure. Her unmarried status, her avoidance of soft living, and her ability to endure hardship all fed into the image of the Virgin Queen. Sleeping in conditions that would make a noblewoman faint only reinforced the idea that she was made of iron, not lace. But iron rusts. And in the damp, worm-laced rushes of a Tudor floor, even a queen could feel the slow crawl of nature against her skin. To understand just how revolting those palace floors could be, you have to get uncomfortably close. Closer than any courtier would dare in Elizabeth's time. The rushes that lined the chambers weren't a pristine carpet of fresh-cut reeds. They were layered in strata, like the rings of a tree, each season's dirt and decay compacted into a dense mat. The top layer might look respectable. Before the Queen arrived at a residence, servants would scatter fresh green rushes, fragrant with herbs like lavender or rosemary, in an attempt to mask the smell. But this was just cosmetic. A floral veil over something far more sinister. Beneath older rushes lay flattened, damp with years of spilled ale, grease from roasted meats, and even human waste. Rats tunneled through these layers, leaving behind droppings. Fleas nested in the soft plant fibers, waiting for the warmth of a body to pass over. And then there were the worms, pale, thin, segmented things, twisting silently in the darkness. The worms were not rare visitors. They were permanent residents. They came in with the plants themselves, hatched from eggs already clinging to the stalks. Once in the warm, wet bedding of the palace floor, they multiplied. Their tiny bodies wriggled through the layers, feeding on the decomposing rushes and any organic matter they could find, including the remnants of meals, scraped from trenchers and carelessly tossed aside. Imagine a still Tudor night, the air heavy with smoke from the great hall's fires, the faint perfume of crushed herbs underfoot, and, if you listened closely, the faint rustle of movement just beneath you. Every step might disturb something alive. Every shift in weight might send a wave of tiny creatures fleeing deeper into the mat. This was the reality of palace life before the age of sanitation. It wasn't just worms. The rushes harbored lice, beetles, and other crawling insects that thrived in the constant cycle of warmth, moisture, and neglect. In summer, the heat accelerated decay, sending up waves of stench that clung to clothing. In winter, the damp stayed trapped, and the creatures clustered in the warmest spots, often near where people slept. For Elizabeth, who sometimes slept directly on the rush-covered floor or had her mattress laid there was no escaping them. Our bedding could be shaken out, her linens washed, but the source was always there, waiting. To remove it would mean stripping the entire floor to the bare boards, a task so laborious and disruptive that it was rarely done. Even for the Queen. To modern sensibilities, the idea of a monarch sleeping with worms crawling beneath her is almost unthinkable. But in Elizabeth's England, it was simply part of the backdrop. The crown could command armies, but it could not command the nature that thrived in the shadows of the throne room. If you lived in Elizabeth I's England, your definition of clean would be nothing like ours. In fact, you might look at a worm-ridden palace floor and call it perfectly respectable, even pleasant, if the right herbs were scattered across it. Cleanliness in Tudor England was less about removing dirt and more about covering up its smell. The logic came from centuries-old beliefs about health and disease. The people of Elizabeth's court had no understanding of germs. They believed sickness was carried by miasma, bad air. If it smelled foul, it was dangerous. If it smelled sweet, it was safe. So the solution wasn't to remove the filth, it was to perfume it. That's why palace servants tossed fragrant rushes, mint, lavender, and rosemary onto the floor. The herbs had a dual purpose. They masked the stench of rot and were thought to purify the air. This gave everyone, including the Queen, a false sense of cleanliness. Underneath, the rushes remained a paradise for vermin and decay. But as long as the air smelled nice, the danger felt invisible. Bathing was also rare. Elizabeth was famously said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. This wasn't laziness, it was fear. Many Tudors believed that bathing opened the pores and allowed illness to seep into the body. A quick rub-down with linen cloths, a dusting of scented powder, and a change of clothing was considered enough. The same logic applied to their surroundings. Disturb the dirt too much, and you might make yourself sick. Better to leave it alone and just keep it smelling fresh. Even the most opulent palaces were built on this philosophy. Kitchens roasted whole stags on open fires, grease and fat dripping to the floors. Spills were covered with herbs, not scrubbed away. Chamber pots were emptied into courtyards or cesspits, and any lingering stench was fought with flowers, not water. Cleaning the rushes meant stripping them up entirely, which was labor-intensive and disruptive, so it was done maybe once or twice a year, sometimes less. In this world, Elizabeth's worm-covered floor wasn't an anomaly. It was the standard. What set her apart was not the filth she endured, but the fact that she endured it as a queen. Even she was bound by the same cultural habits, the same misplaced trust in perfumed air. To us, her chambers were alive with the crawling signs of decay. To her court, they were simply part of a well-run household, because they smelled like lavender. And that's the strange truth. In Tudor England, clean was not the absence of dirt, but the absence of foul odor. The dirt could stay. The worms could stay. As long as you didn't smell them, you were living in luxury. Sleeping in a worm-infested room was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The Tudor bedchamber was a breeding ground for illnesses, many of which could turn deadly in a time when medicine was more superstition than science. And in Elizabeth's case, her sleeping arrangements only increased the risk. The worms themselves weren't the deadliest threat. They were just one part of a living ecosystem, crawling under the rushes. Fleas thrived there too, leaping from the floor to bedding, feeding on human blood. These weren't harmless. Fleas were notorious carriers of disease. Just a few decades before Elizabeth's birth, flea-borne plague had wiped out a third of England's population. While London didn't suffer a major outbreak during her reign, smaller flare-ups were constant, and fleas were always suspect. Rats were another hidden guest. Drawn to leftover food and kitchen scraps, they tunneled under the rushes and roamed at night. With them came lice, ticks, and the potential for all manner of sickness. Servants might hear them scurrying in the dark. While the queen slept only a few feet away, then there was the air itself. The damp rushes released a slow, constant smell, part mold, part rot, that clung to fabrics and lungs alike. To the Tudors, this odor meant bad air, which they believed caused illness. While their miasma theory was wrong about the cause, it wasn't entirely wrong about the risk. Modern science shows that such an environment could harbor harmful molds and bacteria, triggering respiratory problems over time. Elizabeth's bedchamber was also full of firelight and smoke. Palaces relied on open hearths, and chimneys were often clogged or poorly vented. Combined with the stench of rotting rushes, the air was thick, smoky, and humid. People woke with coughing fits. Servants often reported headaches. And yet, this was considered perfectly normal. Even worse, Elizabeth's personal attendants were constantly in and out of her rooms, carrying their own share of germs. Privacy was a rare commodity for a monarch. She was dressed, undressed, and fed in the company of others. Every cough, every sneeze, every unwashed hand added to the invisible dangers of the bedchamber. So, when Elizabeth lay down at night, whether on a mattress or directly on the rush-covered floor, she was surrounded by potential killers. Fleas biting at her ankles, worms wriggling beneath her. The breath of courtiers heavy in the air, the smell of mold and smoke settling into her lungs. And yet she endured it for decades, perhaps never realizing just how much of her health she was gambling away each night. In Tudor England, death was often invisible until it struck, and by then it was far too late. Elizabeth's reign is remembered for glittering court pageants, silken gowns, and a regal presence that dominated every room she entered. In portraits, she appears almost divine, her skin pale and flawless, her dresses stitched with gold, her hair like a halo of flame. But behind the painted mask was a private world that couldn't have been further from the pristine vision her subjects adored. The Tudor court was a theater, and Elizabeth was its leading star. Every public appearance was choreographed to reinforce her image as the Virgin Queen, untouchable, eternal, and above the common filth of mortal life. Her elaborate gowns were designed not just for beauty, but to conceal the realities of aging, fatigue, and any hint of physical weakness. She wore layers of perfume to create a personal aura of freshness, even in sweltering rooms where the air reeked of sweat and smoke. But those who served closest to her knew a different story. The Queen's private chambers, no matter how richly decorated, were bound by the same limitations as any Tudor household. Worm-infested rushes on the floor, damp air heavy with mold, and the constant presence of insects were not things that could be banished by royal decree. Even the wealth of an empire could not conjure modern sanitation. This divide between image and reality was carefully protected. Servants who spoke too freely about the Queen's personal life risked punishment. Discretion was a survival skill in the Tudor court. Those who dressed her each morning might have brushed a worm from her skirts without a word. Those who laid her bedding might have ignored the faint rustle beneath the rushes, trusting that silence was safer than honesty. Elizabeth herself likely embraced the illusion. She understood the power of appearances better than any monarch before her. She may have endured the crawling discomfort of her quarters without complaint, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that even she was subject to the same decay as her people. That was not the message she wanted her reign to send. So the contrast remained. In the throne room, a goddess in human form. In the bedchamber, a woman lying in a space where worms and fleas ruled the night. It is a stark reminder that in the Tudor world, royalty was not a shield against the filth and fragility of life. Elizabeth's genius was in making sure no one saw it. The rushes might have been alive with movement under her feet, but in the eyes of England, she still floated above the earth, untouched, untouchable, and immaculate. In the Tudor imagination, worms were more than just pests. They were symbols of the inevitable decay that claimed all living things. Poets of the time often wrote about worms in connection with death, burial, and the corruption of the body. To sleep above them was, in a way, to lie on the threshold between life and its quiet, crawling aftermath. Elizabeth I, ever conscious of her image, must have understood this symbolism, even if she didn't speak of it. Her reign was filled with pageantry that celebrated her eternal youth and divine right to rule. Yet the reality beneath her feet whispered a different truth. Every wriggling movement in the rushes, every rustle under the floorboards, was a reminder that no crown could keep nature at bay forever. The Tudor world was steeped in such reminders. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral parlors. It was part of daily life. Plague carts rolled through the streets in bad years. Funerals were frequent, even for the young and strong. Churchyards were crowded, their soil rich with the remains of generations. People knew the smell of decay as intimately as they knew the scent of bread or rain. In this context, the worms in the royal bedchamber took on a grim poetry. They were not there to mock her power. They were simply doing what they had always done, breaking down the organic matter that humans left behind. Whether it was in the dirt of a pauperess grave or in the velvet-lined rooms of a palace, their work was the same. Some chroniclers have noted that Elizabeth kept skulls and hourglasses among her personal possessions, symbols of memento mori, or remember you must die. It's possible she viewed the filth in her chambers with a similar stoic acceptance. The worms were part of the same cycle that would one day take her to. In the great chain of being, even the highest link eventually fell. And yet, there's a strange irony in it. Elizabeth ruled over an age of exploration, scientific curiosity, and artistic brilliance. Yet in her most private moments, she lay within arm's reach of the same low creatures that burrowed in peasant cottages. It was as if the palace floor itself refused to let her forget that beneath all the gilding, Sphila still mortal, still destined to join the earth. The worms under her rushes may have been invisible to visiting ambassadors and court painters, but they were there all the same. Tiny, silent heralds of the truth no monarch can escape. When history remembers Elizabeth I, it speaks of the golden age of England, of victory over the Spanish Armada, Shakespeare's plays, of a monarch whose intelligence and charisma shaped a nation. Yet beneath the glory lies a detail so mundane and so strange that it resists the polish of legend. The Queen of England slept in a chamber, where worms crawled beneath her feet. To modernize, this seems almost impossible. How could a ruler with such wealth and power tolerate such conditions? But to understand Elizabeth's legacy, you must accept that Tudor life, even for royalty, was a constant negotiation with discomfort, decay, and danger. The worms were not an aberration. They were the background noise of the age. In her own time, no one would have thought the less of her for it. Her courtiers would have seen the perfumed rushes, the gold-threaded tapestries, and the gleam of silver dishes, not the living world beneath the floor. And Elizabeth herself likely saw no contradiction between ruling an empire and sharing her chambers with creatures of the earth. That was life. That was nature. But in a symbolic sense, the worms are the perfect counterpoint to her image. They remind us that even the most powerful people in history lived in bodies and environments far more fragile than their portraits suggest. Elizabeth's greatness lay not in being above such realities, but in ruling effectively despite them. She navigated treacherous politics, religious conflict, and international threats, all while surrounded by the same physical hardships that plagued her subjects. Her reign's splendor was built on a foundation that, quite literally, could rot beneath her. And perhaps that is why she clung so fiercely to her image as the Virgin Queen, untouched, unaging, almost immortal. It wasn't just a political strategy. It was a form of defiance against the dirt, disease, and death that were constant companions in Tudor life. Today, the story of her worm-covered floor is a reminder that history's icons were never as untouchable as they seemed. Their lives were messy, uncomfortable, and profoundly human. Elizabeth, I may have worn gowns that shimmered in candlelight, but she also stepped over crawling life each morning and lay down at night within reach of it. And yet she endured. More than that, she triumphed. The worms didn't diminish her reign. They sharpened the contrast between her reality and the legend she built. If anything, knowing the truth makes her achievements all the more remarkable. In the end, the queen who slept with worms remains one of history's brightest figures, not because she was immune to the crawling forces of decay, but because she ruled anyway, unshaken, as the world beneath her continued its slow, inevitable work.